So with the recent release of chapter 543 and the series of chapters preceding it, a lot of questions have been raised surrounding the character of Jinrang, the king of Busan, from both a power scaling and writing lens, and that's mainly due to the difference in performance and anticipation built up for this guy. In this video I want to go over the community reaction for Jinrang versus Taesu and Gangseop, the most likely reason for the community's reaction, and then I want to approach Jinrang from a scaling lens and look at how strong he really is, and if his fight with James Lee is really even closer, if it will ever be conceived in the first place. So to bring you guys up to speed on what's been taking place in the last couple chapters in case you fell asleep whilst reading, in which case the last panel of chapter 541 would be the most recent event you remember, and that would be the cliffhanger between Jinrang and Big Daniel, in which we were expecting a hard-fought battle in chapter 542, or at least the beginning of one, and to say what we got was underwhelming would be an understatement. Chapter 542 was an absolute abomination of a chapter in my personal opinion, even though I've seen plenty of positive reactions to the chapter, but I personally found it hard to enjoy a chapter that starts out by sidelining the main character and also the alleged main villain of the arc to show us Jinrang's right-hand man spit glass at Zack Lee, and don't even get me started on the fraud who had to betray his light, was saying he would never betray his light in order to try to gain a synthetic upper hand, which turned out to be non-existent, as he makes a joke out of himself in front of his own master, going back to dirty boxing and still not winning the fight. I won't talk much on Zack Lee though because everyone loves that guy, but the chapter ends with Taesu and Gangseop challenging Jinrang for some reason, and chapter 543 shows us exactly that. They actually challenged Jinrang, like they put up a fucking very decent fight, which I personally didn't expect from them, but I guess I should have now that I look at it. However, that was up until Jinrang decides, you know what, I'm getting slammed here, Taesu just hit me with a divorce settlement of a punch, it isn't looking good for me here, I'm gonna use conviction real quick and hit him with an attack with allegedly the same power behind it as Prime Gaprion, and this is where it kinda gets wicked. Now, going back to the community reaction, I'm gonna be basing my claims on the YouTube community, Reddit community, TikTok community, and people I've talked to on Discord, and I would say it's a one-sided response, but it actually isn't. Disappointment seems to ever so slightly tip the scale though, and I want to delve a bit deeper into that and why such a response might come to be. Now, I'm not trying to convince you to like Jinrang or anything, you can like who you like, but downplaying him is a completely different story, especially when it's backed up by the notion that the characters or the way PTJ decided to execute his character wasn't exactly in all of our favors. It was disappointing having him fight against Taesu and Gangseop, and not the most exciting decision, especially when you chose two first-generation kings who have already fought by the way and shouldn't have ever had a deciding role in this arc, to replace the main character who we've been waiting for some supplement to for god knows how long. What's even more disappointing to me is PTJ's decision to go with the conviction route, even though it was very expected with the whole Gapriong's disciple thing and the resemblance between him and Jake, but I think it's notable that this plays a pretty big role in this whole undermining Jinrang thing. The fact that Jinrang was pushed to conviction against Gangseop and Taesu doesn't make him weak, it doesn't make him a Seong Ji victim, and it certainly doesn't kill his character. It was ass, it wasn't enjoyable, and I literally hated the chapter, but there's a difference between being pushed to conviction and being pushed whilst using conviction. What I'm trying to get at here is that using this disappointment to claim he's weak or he's a low tier is both not provable and pretty clear bias, and this is one of the main reasons I hated the way PTJ decided to execute his fight with Taesu and Gangseop, because this whole conviction trope and protecting your people thing creates such a large gap between how strong a character is in base and how strong a character is when in this form, and that large gap is what certain people tend to ignore due to it being out of the ordinary, therefore making baseless assumptions that he's a fraud. It's actually very comparable to Gun's TUI form, where a character goes from getting absolutely shit on, Exhibit A Gun vs Gu before TUI, to turning the tables entirely and winning with ease, Exhibit B Gun vs Gu after TUI, and it's pretty horrible because it confuses people, rubs them the wrong way, pushes them to undermine a character and not want to give them a chance, and put them below someone like Seong Ji. Now, the effect that this has left on the community when it comes to Jinrang is that, again, due to this large gap in power between base and conviction, following a questionable performance against opponents you'd think he one-shots or beats with ease, has led people to completely disregard what happened at the end of the fight and immediately say he's a fraud, because people usually say someone's a fraud when they aren't as strong as you think they are, and that's what people are claiming here due to the fact that Jinrang wasn't as strong as we thought he would be in base. Now, what happens if we don't let this disappointment blind our vision and actually take a look at Jinrang's conviction form? Well, that's when we notice that Jinrang isn't actually as disappointing as we thought he was, and merely the fact that he isn't a monster in base or that he relies on a disappointing amp, which is conviction, for his strength, doesn't allow us to downplay him. A character having a disappointing amp character-wise, a subpar performance in base, and existing resentment towards the execution of his character due to weak consistency with build-up doesn't give us an excuse to downplay him. Character-wise, maybe. Again, you can like who you like and dislike who you dislike, but don't call him a fraud strength-wise because he relies on conviction, a disappointing amp, because that has nothing to do with how strong he is overall, and neither does it comply with the meaning of the word fraud. This wasn't really deceptive, it was expected from Gapriong's disciple, and we've become aware of PTJ's tendencies at this point. If he decided to give Jake conviction because he's Gapriong's son, it's to be expected with his disciple. And I find it ironic that when Jake had to rely on conviction, people were hating on his character more than his strength, because it was clear to us all that he was strong, and that was the pivotal basis of disappointment, which is that he's strong for a reason we don't like. But But when the same thing happens to Jinrang, apparently we hate on how strong he is, claiming he's a fraud. And this irony kind of fades away when you realize that this is based on the fact that he didn't fight who we wanted him to fight, coupled with his subpar performance in base, which is what I mentioned earlier. Let's be real, expecting anything but conviction from Jinrang is pretty naive, and I do not understand why we're still giving PTJ the benefit of the doubt. It's disappointing, very, but doesn't make him weak. Now with that being said, how strong actually is Jinrang? Is his fight with James Lee even close? Well, we don't have the answer to that. This is another disillusioning attribute of the conviction amp, ambiguity and vagueness. I mean sure, Gapryong implies Jinrang's attacks are now of the same power as his, but we don't know that for sure and we don't have enough evidence for that, which is why I've avoided talking about Jinrang's scaling and how strong he is. It's unfortunately both a wiser decision and pretty much the only option that doesn't leave us with fallible conclusions. Is his fight with James still close? Also maybe. We don't know exactly how much more durable James has gotten since his training with Gitae and what exactly it did for his body in terms of the degree of attacks he can tank. It's entirely possible that he can tank conviction attacks that are supposedly on par with Gapryong when it comes to power. That is, if conviction serves as some sort of universal equalizer when it comes to power, and so therefore the strength behind an attack is determined not by physical stats but by intent, meaning that someone fighting to protect their friends wields the same force as another with entirely different physical capabilities driven by the same purpose, making Jinrang, Gapryong, and Jake's attacks have the same power. But we don't know that yet, and neither do we know how fast the attack is and if someone like James would even get hit by it or simply dodge. I do want to say though, I think a fight between Jinrang and James is a little less likely after this performance against Taesu and Gongxia, which is another reason for the disappointment of the community, me included, and that's because the fact that he was pushed to this extent wears his body down and makes it so that if he were ever to fight against James Lee in this arc, it would be James Lee versus a fatigued Jinrang, which, in an attempt to avoid disappointing either fanbase, disappoints both. That's pretty much all I've got to say.